So my name is JerriAnne Boggis. I'm the Executive Director for the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, where we're working to raise awareness for New Hampshire's Black history in order to create more inclusive communities here in New Hampshire. And we are at the cemetery in Canterbury to talk about the Sampson Battis story, where David Waters, who is with me, will share his knowledge.
Yeah, and I am David Waters. I'm a board member of the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire, and here exploring how we can, unearth the Black history of New Hampshire and so many of these towns that have African burying grounds, and really learn some of the stories about New Hampshire freedom and citizenship by discovering this history. Well, JerriAnne, I spent a lot of time in graveyards, mostly looking at early New Hampshire burying grounds, and I came into Canterbury, classic New England town with its white church and so on, and I wanted to see the Revolutionary War heroes. And I was walk around and I came across here, and it goes down to this swampy area, and I looked down in this corner and I said, well, there's a gravestone down there. That's kind of unusual. And I started to come down this way, and then I noticed that there are all these other little nubs of stone around it, and a couple of pieces of stone that aren't from the area, and it started to have all the hallmarks of an African American burying ground, because away from the white people but still in the cemetery. And then I came and saw this Revolutionary War marker, and it just leaps out, Sampson Battis. And so I thought, who was this person? And it said, he had served in Canterbury's regiment sent off. And so I thought, maybe I can find out something about him. And this gravestone became a kind of a doorway that opened into the Revolutionary War and what freedom means here. I mean, you've studied George Blanchard and other Revolutionary War soldiers whose histories were erased, and they wanted freedom to be for everybody. And so I thought, well, what's the story here, and who were all these probably other African Americans that are buried around here, and what was the enslaved population in Canterbury? Who were they, and what do we learn about freedoms? It appears that he was born around 1750, and maybe in Durham, in the Thompson family, because they owned a slave named Peter Battis, and or maybe in Rollinsford, the Wentworth home in Rollinsford. They raised a lot of slaves who were sold into Portsmouth and then up into the countryside, because as these communities up here were being opened up in the 1740s and 1750s, as the Abenakis were being exterminated and driven north, they needed a labor force, and the ministers and the prominent people who weren't going to get their hands dirty wanted to have an enslaved workforce with them. So he probably born around 1750. He is probably in Canterbury by the late 1750s, early 1760s as a young person, and then he's enslaved by a man named Archelaus Moore, and then in 1775 he goes off with the Minutemen. Canterbury sends a contingent down after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and they don't go to Bunker Hill. They go to kind of be the siege of Boston. So he's encamped outside of Boston for a few months, then comes back. Then in 1781 he goes back in, and he's marching down to New York, and then maybe even to join George Washington's troops. But Cornwallis is defeated, and he ends up his last service of Charleston, New Hampshire, and then comes back here. Now, kind of like other African Americans after the war, one way or another, he gets his freedom.
So were they promised their freedom if they fought for their owners?
Well, that's often a story. I think that's a story that was created by white families to make the revolution seem like it was a freedom moment, but it's unclear exactly when Sampson Battis became free. And then one thing that also often happened is that these Revolutionary War veterans, they did get their freedom, and they sometimes got land. And I think there was a sense that from the formerly enslaved people that they were obligated. They had given their labor for decades, and they were owed something. And they maintained that relationship with the enslaving family. And one thing, so either leased land or given land by around 1792 or so, he had some land down in the southwestern part of town towards Concord. His owner, Arcus Moore, was moving up to Loudon. There are other family members around here, but he got some land, and this is, these landowners from the Revolutionary War gathered clusters of African Americans around them. In 1790, he's in the census for down in just south of Concord, where there was another Revolutionary War veteran, Scipio Page, with some land, and they were building a meeting house there. But then he's back up here, and suddenly you have an area in Canterbury called New Guinea, and there are New Guineas all over the state. There are New Guineas in Exeter. New Guineas wherever these folks gathered. They call it sometimes you see Coffee Town for Kofi, the Friday name, or Cuffy in New Hampshire, or you see Guinea Road as there is in Exeter and other parts around the state. So we know these were these settlements. So these Guinea towns were people were gatherings of African Americans, and with Sampson Battis, he and his wife Lucy had 7 children. His daughter Sophia had 22 children. One of his sons, Sampson Jr., had 7 children. One of his neighbors, a woman by the name of Ayers, who had been enslaved, had 18 children. And so there were a lot of black people living in this area. But in the census, they're not there. There might be 5 people counted. There might be 14 people counted. When there are many more in these areas.
So that's the fallacy of an all-white state, especially when you have communities in places like Canterbury, and you're naming those families with all those children. We're not talking 2 or 3 black people in the town. Well, and we're actually talking the community of folks.
And they knew their identity and who they were and what their history was. One of Sampson Battis's granddaughters is named Sampson, because they so wanted to keep that name alive in the family. And that name Battis stuck in the family. Even in town records, as late as the 1840s and 1850s, they would write the name for his grandchildren Battis, but then have a little asterisk and say Is Battis. So they knew. They knew in town. Name. And, for him too, and for a lot of African American communities in New Hampshire in the 1700s and 1800s, there was mixture with native people. Sampson's wife, Lucy, she was a West Indian Indian. She was owned by a prominent family in Concord, the Coffin family. And Battis, who clearly was going back and forth to Concord on business for folks up here and for labor and so on, met her and wanted to marry her, and so he agreed to work for a year for the Coffin family. And as remarked in the historical record, that was about $40 would have been a man's payment for a year, or about the cost of a yoke of oxen. So Lucy was compared to a yoke of oxen, and he purchased her out of slavery, and they marry. So it really suggests that for Battis, that this recognition that this mixture of races, that this was not a white state, that declaring freedom here meant for him, and the Revolutionary War meant that the future New Hampshire was going to be a multiracial place, and that freedom was going to be for all people. There's a story by Samuel Gilman, and his farm, his ancestors' farm, was next to the Moores' farm. And he remembered when he was a boy in the 1840s, he said a very aged Negro man came to visit the Moors and came over to visit his family. And there was a large tree growing in front of the house. And Battis told a story about how when he was a young boy, he had gone over to see this tree, and he'd pulled it up by its roots to see if it was still growing, and was roundly whipped for that. And you have to, understand the importance of tree planting at that time, that when families founded their household and built their mansion, or built their family homestead, they planted trees out in front. And trees were associated with genealogy, with the kind of tree of, American life and family rootedness and so on. And there's Battis saying, I pulled it up and I was whipped. So it becomes, the American family tree becomes a whipping tree in this story. And I think, Battis too, he certainly understood the contrast there. You have the George Washington story becoming popularized about barking the father's cherry tree and not telling a lie. And so trees were very resonant. Or George Washington's elm in Cambridge, where he first took command of the armies, and that tree was venerated. And the Charter Oak in Connecticut, the veneration of trees, and Battis saying, I pulled it up to see what the roots were. And it's I was here. The roots of American freedom are false unless they include my family too. And so here's this old man telling this young boy this story in front of his ancestral home, saying, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Do you get it? Do you get it? Do you get it?" And I think that really suggests that he was intensely aware. By as late as the 1840s and before his death in 1852, at age 102, that he was rooted here, and that story should not be ripped up.